Luxury suite for rent, free for women, double charge for men. A silly guy, named Steve, privately asked me about the rent, which was thousands per month. I felt a surge of pride and held out my hand, stating a flat 5,000. I thought he would haggle. To my surprise, Steve just grinned and handed me 60,000 on the spot. He didn't even bother to read the rental agreement, which was truly unexpected. Ladies and gentlemen, the late night story begins. If you want more exciting and suspenseful tales, remember to check out my homepage. A reminder, there's a fee for the main story. He chuckled and handed over his ID for me to copy. I compared the photo on the ID multiple times and realized it didn't match him at all. I was taken aback and regarded Steve with suspicion. He smiled reassuringly and said, "Don't worry, I'm not a bad guy." Seeing the hefty 60,000, I pushed down my doubts. Noticing my hesitation, he suggested renting first and we could negotiate the price after a year. Hearing this, I completely dismissed my worries, thinking that it would be foolish to turn down an easy opportunity. Still, I kept my guard up. I drafted a supplementary agreement that clearly stated this property was for residential use only, with any illegal activities strictly prohibited, and the tenant would bear the consequences. Steve chuckled and signed without hesitation. My wife, Linda, was overjoyed. Originally, I thought we'd be lucky to rent the place for 1,000, and now it was taken for 5,000. What a big spender he was. After he moved in, I soon realized he really was a bit slow upstairs. One night, a neighbor named Tom called to complain about the new tenant constantly banging around, making it impossible for anyone to sleep. The next day after work, I went to see Steve, and what I found shocked me. He had sealed every window in the house with cement and red bricks. I was furious and asked, "What on earth are you doing?" He rolled his eyes and replied, "Is sealing windows illegal?" I was momentarily speechless. It wasn't illegal, but the house was mine. What did he mean by sealing the windows? He looked at me expressionlessly and coldly said, "I've paid the rent, your windows are a place that shouldn't see the light." The world is full of surprises, so many different types of people exist. His expression relaxed, and he added, "I'll restore it when you move out." Hearing that, I didn't bother arguing further. I thought he could do whatever he wanted as long as he didn't destroy my house. Little did I know, what happened next made me want to kick him out. He started urinating everywhere in the community, and it got worse. Anyone who argued with him would find their doors smeared with his mess. The residents were complaining loudly, and several neighbors came to me repeatedly, urging me to get rid of him. I didn't dare admit to collecting 60,000, or they might get jealous and cause trouble. All I could do was calm them down and then talk to him. I entered the house and was stunned. Not only were the windows sealed, but all the light fixtures had been removed. The walls, once painted white, were now covered in a deep black, leaving me to rely on candles for light. It was clear he couldn't stand the light. My anger flared. "Steve, what's going on in here? Are you just going to pee wherever because you don't have a bathroom?" He merely smiled and continued to smoke, taking only one puff from the Red Tower cigarette before letting it burn out without a second drag. His next drag was heavy, as if even his very soul had dimmed. "Say something. If you don't, I'm really leaving. If I give you 60,000 more, will you force me out? What do you want from me?" He stood up and walked into the bedroom, pulling out 6 stacks of cash from his suitcase. I was taken aback, feeling like he didn't care about money at all, as if it had just fallen from the sky. "Steve, what exactly do you do?" He smiled a bleak smile and replied, "That's none of your concern, just take the money." He forcefully shoved the money into the bag. Honestly, I couldn't resist the lure of cash whatsoever. No matter how the neighbors complained, I pretended not to hear. Although Steve had a terrible reputation among them. He seemed close with a 19-year-old boy named Liam who lived upstairs. They looked like lovers. Liam was a transfer student, tall and muscular, with a buzz cut and a well-groomed appearance. He was somewhat handsome, but seeing a nearly 50-year-old man cozying up to a 19-year-old boy was unsettling. Steve bought Liam Nike sneakers, a laptop, and the latest Samsung phone. Such gestures were enough to raise eyebrows. The neighbors gossiped about them, but Liam didn't care at all, letting Steve act like his sugar daddy. Liam's parents worked out of town for long periods and completely neglected him. Steve not only bought him things but also cooked meals for him. Liam's weight was skyrocketing, and he was out of breath when he walked. Although Steve played the role of a caring mother in front of him, I sensed that he harbored a secret that couldn't be hidden when alone. I anxiously approached Liam, hoping he would distance himself from this so-called sugar daddy. Steve was definitely not an ordinary person, he must have hidden secrets. But Liam shrugged it off. My sugar daddy treats me better than my real dad. Stay out of my business. Steve really did take good care of him. One day, Liam got into trouble outside, and a few thugs threatened to break his arms. Upon seeing this, Steve first wailed, then grinned and begged the thugs for mercy. The thugs, noticing his erratic behavior, joked, "Give us 50,000, and we'll buy your kid a new arm." To my shock, Steve really did hand them 50,000, and the thugs burst into laughter. Having a sugar daddy like this is truly lucky. I could hardly believe my ears. Either Liam was his biological son, or they had an ambiguous relationship. There was no other possibility. Just then, I received a call from the power company, informing me that they needed to replace the meter, and the homeowner had to be home. I called Steve, but he didn't pick up. After the staff replaced the meter, they remarked, "Your place hardly uses any electricity." I explained, "The tenant doesn't use electricity much." Then, after the staff finished in the hallway, I noticed the front door was left open. I knocked on the door. "Steve, are you there?" There was no response. I pulled open the outer security door and knocked on the wooden door inside, only to find it wasn't locked either. Steve didn't seem worried about cash being stolen. Just as I was about to close the door, I glanced inside and saw that the trash can was overflowing with rubbish. I felt a pang in my heart. This much money could be seen as my good deed. I thought about taking out the trash when I noticed the bin was filled with various medication packaging. It was all sorts of psychiatric drugs. It seemed this guy knew he wasn't mentally well and was taking medication to cope. But then, I suddenly felt something was off. There was a note in the trash that read, "On May 12th, take 10 tablets of clozapine, 1 strip of hydrochloride quetiapine 10 tablets, plus 10 capsules of fluoxetine hydrochloride, and 10 extended-release venlafaxine tablets." The note was signed at the bottom with his name, the handwriting bold and firm, clearly indicating he was seriously ill, needing to take so many pills daily. This note detailing his medication regimen had obviously been torn from a regular notebook. Sure enough, there was a nearly empty notebook on the small table nearby. The last few pages documented his medication intake for subsequent days, as if reminding himself to take his medicine on time. I felt an inexplicable heartache. Here was a lonely man, childless and alone, dealing with medications every day. What shocked me even more was that he not only had drugs as his companions, but there was also a receipt from a plastic surgery clinic under the glass on the table. The receipt was from a cosmetic surgery clinic in another province, and there was no way Steve would have undergone plastic surgery. Surgery is typically done to enhance beauty. No one wants to make themselves unrecognizable. Unless Steve's surgery was a failed attempt. Or perhaps it wasn't Steve getting surgery but rather his wife. However, the receipt clearly bore the name Steve Wine. With my doubts growing, I looked up the phone number of that cosmetic surgery clinic online, and to my surprise, the doctor remembered Steve more than any other cosmetic surgery patient. The doctor used the word subversive to describe Steve, stating that he was quite odd. Cosmetic surgery is usually performed to enhance beauty, but he wanted to subvert his appearance. I found it hard to understand and asked what he meant by that. The doctor responded, "He wanted to turn into another person." In other words, the doctor said. I swapped his entire face. I confirmed it wasn't the same Steve I knew, added the doctor on QQ, and sent him a copy of Steve's ID. The doctor confidently replied, "That's him." Just as I was about to ask more questions, the power suddenly went out. A doctor friend warned me that if he continued taking these medications, he would eventually face mental issues. I knew he was deliberately calling me. I recalled the first time I met Steve. His eyes were glazed, and he had a scruffy beard. Looking closely at his face, there indeed were signs of cosmetic surgery. When I first rented to him, I hadn't thought much about it. He prepared a feast for me, and we lit candles to eat and chat. The candlelight cast an eerie glow on his bizarre face. "Mr. Wright, what kind of person do you think I am?" he suddenly asked me. The question caught me off guard, and I shook my head, saying, "I don't know." He just grinned. "I don't even know myself." "Why do you take so many psychiatric drugs?" I cautiously asked him, but he avoided the question. "You came here. I know you deliberately locked the door." "You deliberately ignored my calls."
I know you locked the door when the power company came to change the meter. What is it for, Mr. Wright? Let's return to the initial question. What kind of person do you think I am? I urged him. Steve, I have a friend who's a doctor. You should really go see a hospital. Taking this much medication could lead to serious issues. He smiled confidently, looking very at ease. I had never seen such a bright smile on his face before. Mr. Wright, remember our agreement. You just collect the money, don't interfere with anything else, including whether I'm mentally ill or not. Why did he emphasize that so much? In a way, I didn't really believe he was mentally ill. At least not based on his behavior. Sure, he urinated in public and argued with people. But just like how he chose not to answer my calls and didn't lock the door, everything he did seemed intentional. Of course, that was just my feeling and speculation. Aside from taking a lot of psychiatric medication, he had also consumed considerable amounts of liquor just as the candles burned out. I didn't know if alcohol and medication would have adverse reactions. But from his behavior, if he really was mentally ill, he might lash out at me at any moment. I felt a sense of panic, so I quickly made up an excuse. And after leaving his house, I stopped at a small restaurant around the corner to grab a bite. By coincidence, I ran into the same thugs who had clashed with Liam before. That old man seems to have plenty of cash, let's hit him again. He might just give us some money. Others chimed in. Let's do it, this cash is easy pickings. Normally, I would choose to keep my distance, other people's troubles weren't my concern, and I didn't want to get involved. But today, for some reason, I felt compelled to argue with the thugs. You guys are heartless, taking advantage of a mentally ill person. It's disgraceful. The thugs, dressed in tank tops and smoking, didn't look friendly at all. Anger surged within me, and I lunged forward, kicking one of them. They immediately swarmed me, and I was quickly knocked to the ground, completely overwhelmed. At that moment, Steve suddenly burst through the crowd, wielding 2 kitchen knives and rushing toward me. The other thugs tried to fight back with chairs, but Steve charged in with his knives, scaring them off in just a few moments. The restaurant owner shouted, "You guys are crazy. Don't you realize he has mental issues? If he kills you, it's a crime." Steve chased after one of the lead thugs, continuing to swing the knives. Fearing that something truly terrible might happen, I quickly grabbed him. Steve, stop it. You don't want to spend the rest of your life in prison, do you? He dropped the knives, his eyes red and swollen, cursing the thugs from start to finish. He also berated me and the restaurant owner. What's so great about owning a restaurant? I used to eat in places way better than yours. I've been to 5-star hotels. And you, why are you holding me? My dragon-slaying sword hasn't tasted blood in ages. Steve roared, while the restaurant owner shook his head. Oh, we shouldn't stoop to his level. I quickly added. Steve, can you tell who the enemy is? His eyes went blank for a moment, then he shrugged and picked up the kitchen knife, beginning to sing. Swiftly gone, oh how swift, longing to meet again, oh, swiftly gone, what a swift sadness, everything blown away by the wind. His voice was clear and resonant, floating into the apartment I rented to him, creating an eerie atmosphere. When I got home, my wife noticed the bruises on my face and asked with concern what had happened. I lied and said I had fallen by accident. I didn't dare tell her the truth, fearing she would overthink it, but she told me she had seen Liam laughing and joking with some thugs. That's impossible. Just a few days ago, Liam and those thugs had a fight. Didn't they threaten to break his arms? My wife shook her head. You're being foolish. Don't underestimate Liam, he's cleverer than he looks. He knows Steve has mental issues and has been scheming to get his money. I didn't expect Steve to fall for it. I asked her. How do you know this? She explained. Once, I was passing by Liam's school and overheard some students talking about that 50,000. Liam must have pocketed at least 20 grand. No wonder those thugs are still thinking of hitting up Steve again, his money comes too easily. To verify this, the next afternoon, I hid outside Liam's school. After school, that kid didn't head home but turned into an alley. I saw him slip into an internet cafe, sitting in front of a computer with some thugs, smoking, and playing a game. Damn, I couldn't have been more right. The thugs were brainstorming ways to continue extorting Steve, and Liam looked anxious, saying, "The last method isn't working anymore, we need to think of something else this time." Liam declared. This time let's hit him hard, let's get 100 grand out of the old man. The thugs excitedly slapped their hands together, calling him Big brother! I snorted in disdain and turned to head back to the school. I found the dean and informed him that Liam and some thugs were smoking and gaming in the internet cafe. The dean, accompanied by Liam's homeroom teacher, stormed into the cafe, only to find Liam with a cigarette in his mouth, engrossed in the game. The dean's face turned livid as he asked Liam, "Have you had enough fun yet?" Hearing this, Liam trembled in fear, unable to utter a word. The thugs, seeing this, pushed their chairs back, attempting to argue with the teachers, but the dean showed no mercy, calling the police and having the thugs arrested. The homeroom teacher, furious, said, "Liam, get your dad here right now. You're completely out of control smoking at school." Liam fell silent, just staring at his cigarette. "If you can't get your dad here, then don't bother coming to school," the dean stated sternly. Furious, Liam stormed out of the courtyard, but instead of going home, he knocked on Steve's door. Later, I heard that Steve had indeed met with the dean under the guise of being Liam's father that day, but he was quickly found out. First of all, Steve and Liam didn't resemble each other at all. Secondly, with Steve's erratic behavior, how could he possibly pass for a father? Thirdly, when Liam transferred to this school, the dean had met his real father. When Liam's biological father, Mr. Hu, arrived at the school, the dean told him, "Not only is Liam smoking outside, but he also found a lunatic impersonating you. If you don't intervene, Liam will truly be lost." Mr. Hu cut off his son's allowance and sent someone to investigate Steve's background. It was peculiar for someone doing business out of town to dig into a lunatic's background. Meanwhile, news of Steve's behavior in the community quickly reached Mr. Hu's ears. Naturally, Mr. Hu came to find me. "Mr. Wright, when did this guy move in?" I replied honestly. "It's been almost half a year now." "A lunatic so close to my son, don't you find that strange?" I said. "Nothing strange about it, they're just old friends." Mr. Hu fell silent, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "He might have other motives. Is he really a lunatic? That still needs to be questioned." After saying that, he left to make a phone call. And when he returned, he was visibly trying to control his emotions. I exchanged a few pleasantries with him, and then he hurried out. Obviously, after that phone call, someone must have told him something. Liam soon moved out of the community, and no one knew where he went. Steve continued to act as he always had, wandering around crazily, but I no longer saw him and Liam walking together. As Steve's lease was nearing its end, with only 3 months left, I passed by the community on my way home from work and saw Liam standing at the entrance, looking around as if he were waiting for someone. "Mr. Wright, why isn't my sugar daddy home?" I joked. "What, planning to hit up your sugar daddy?" He chuckled in response. "How could I hit him up? I haven't seen him for a while, and his gaze seems to have hardened. With the way he dresses, he doesn't look like a student at all. Where has my sugar daddy gone crazy this time?" Just then, Steve appeared at the entrance of the alley. Strolling leisurely, hands clasped behind his back, stopping in front of a rundown restaurant, glancing around before shouting a few curse words at the owner. "What's so impressive about running a restaurant? I've eaten at 5-star hotels without batting an eye, and I pass by here without a glance at you." He then walked into the community gate. "Aren't you looking for your sugar daddy?" "Here he comes," I said to Liam. But Liam just smiled and stood still, watching Steve enter the community. Suddenly, Steve turned to me. "I've got plenty of money, buying this house 8 or 10 times is no problem." I was bewildered, and Liam stepped forward, tentatively asking, "Mr. Liang, do you still remember me?" Steve turned to him, and his once dull eyes brightened with clarity. He wrapped an arm around Liam's shoulders, saying, "Oh, it's you, Liam. You're back. Hee hee, I bought you another pair of Nike shoes, size 42. They should fit perfectly this time." Liam was stunned for a few seconds and asked, "You must remember Lulu, right?" Steve smiled brightly but responded with something else entirely. "Hee hee, you like braised pig trotters, don't you? I'll get started on that right away." The two of them headed upstairs, with Liam walking in front and Steve following behind. Suddenly, Steve turned back to look at me, smiling. A few days later, I saw Liam and Steve coming in and out of the community together, and the residents had become accustomed to it. Some even said that Liam was actually Steve's illegitimate son, a thought I had entertained at one point. But I quickly dismissed it. Physically, Liam and Steve bore no resemblance whatsoever.
As for why Steve was trying to get close to Liam and the names Liang Yong and Lulu mentioned by Liam, I had no particular interest.
Didn't Steve say?
I just collect the money, don't worry about anything else. Since he moved in, I had already collected $120,000 from him, and anything that followed was no concern of mine.
However, one thing puzzled me: Steve didn't have a job, so where was he getting all that money? My wife said. Can't he have some savings? I retorted. Having savings doesn't mean you can spend it mindlessly. He certainly doesn't treat money like money. I sensed he was trying to keep me in check. With 2 months left until the lease expired, Steve invited me to his place for a chat. I thought to myself, what could he possibly want from me? Mr. Wright, I have a favor to ask.
When it was just the two of us, he maintained his politeness.
Mr. Wright, could you help Liam find a job near the community? After dropping out, he didn't want to take the job his father found for him. He wants something closer to home. I asked with curiosity. What exactly is your relationship with Liam?
He chuckled.
Have you forgotten our agreement? You just collect the money, you don't need to worry about anything else. My heart tightened. Steve, I know how you spent that $50,000. I want to deal with those thugs along with Liam.
He waved a hand dismissively.
I don't need to know. You just need to find him a job nearby. But you can't say I asked you to do this. My confusion deepened. Why would he believe I can do this? My contacts here aren't that strong.
I felt uneasy, starting to doubt Steve's true intentions. I could now confirm that Steve's madness was just a facade.
He had an indescribable charm.
Since moving in, I had been led around by him, from sealing the windows to him deliberately letting me see the medication in the trash. And now he wanted me to help Liam find a job. I began to suspect that every one of his actions was part of a larger scheme. In the end, I used my connections to help Liam find a clerical job nearby, which mainly involved organizing documents and assisting with train ticket purchases and other odd jobs.
Why are you being so kind? Liam asked me. I made up a casual excuse. I do some labor recruitment on the side and earn commissions. Just work hard and stop wasting your time.
He took my words at face value. Everyone knew that Mr. Wright was the type who meddled in others' affairs.
Steve continued to showcase his madness in front of everyone.
Only when alone with me did he appear to be a rational, mature man, as if everything had already been settled. Sitting at my computer feeling bored, I logged into my QQ farm, only to find that almost all my vegetables had been stolen. A gloomy avatar flashed at the bottom of the screen, and I opened the chat window. Our exchanges had been sparse over the past few months. The doctor had mentioned that Steve had altered his appearance, and the doctor's final recovery notes completely changed my impression of him.
Doctor, this doesn't add up. The age seems off. The ID says he was born in 1965.
It appeared that he was only in his 20s when he was at the hospital. After his surgery, there had been some unpleasant incidents with the hospital. The doctor mentioned that Steve was unhappy with his post-surgery appearance. Steve felt he hadn't truly transformed his looks, the traces of his previous appearance still lingered. The hospital had to perform a few more adjustments for him, but Steve remained dissatisfied and often troubled the hospital.
As their meetings increased, the hospital realized that Steve had mental health issues.
They regretted having performed cosmetic surgery on a patient with such problems. It was no wonder he wanted to alter his appearance. A normal person wouldn't make such a request. However, at that time, Steve hadn't voiced any objections to the various surgical fees, which allowed the hospital to agree to the procedure. To quell this somewhat troubling situation, the hospital agreed to refund part of the costs, mainly out of fear that Steve would make a scandal, which they wouldn't be able to manage. Steve didn't want the money at all. He insisted on further surgeries,
prompting the hospital to feel it necessary to contact Steve's parents.
However, Steve only stammered, unsure whether he was unwilling to provide his parents' contact information or simply couldn't remember. Standing in front of the hospital mirror, Steve pointed at his face and said,
"You promised to deliver what you said. If you can't, then don't operate a cosmetic surgery clinic." I asked the doctor, "How many surgeries did you perform on him in total?" "4 in total."
"Did he ever come back to see you?"
The doctor shook his head.
"No, by the last time I saw him, I could no longer recognize his previous appearance."
In his 20s, Steve had a 1965 birth date on his ID.
And I boldly speculated that aside from his photo being real, everything else was fake.
My wife said, "If it comes to that, just call the police. Who knows what he was up to before?" I told her. On what grounds would we call the police? If they find out the ID is fake, they'll ask why we didn't report it when we noticed the discrepancy between the real person and the photo. Things were becoming increasingly complex, so I tried to minimize my contact with Steve. Once the lease was up, I wouldn't let him rent again. I felt I could return the extra $60,000 given to me by Steve without issue, but there was one matter I needed to handle first. I planned to find Steve because the gas company needed to replace the gas meter. I called him to ask if he was home, secretly hoping he wasn't, as I really didn't want to see him again. Steve was smiling the whole time but didn't say a word. I nodded to him as a form of greeting. Suddenly, Steve stood up, wearing a cold expression. "What are you doing in my house? Haven't you already collected the rent?" I was baffled by his question. "It's not about the rent, I'll leave as soon as they finish replacing the gas meter." But Steve blocked my way, his eyes bloodshot, pointing at the gas workers and asking me, "You son of a bitch, did you bring this guy here to challenge me?" I completely couldn't understand what he was going on about. "Let me tell you, you better watch out, my dragon-slaying sword is not to be trifled with," I quickly emphasized. "Steve, look closely, I'm Mr. Right, your landlord, not your enemy." "Then who is my enemy?" His eyes widened, as if ready for a fight. "Tell me, and I'll get my revenge." His emotions were overwhelming. "Damn it, give me his address, and I'll chop off his head." He then rushed into the kitchen, grabbed a kitchen knife, and urgently asked me, "Quick, tell me where Steve is." I was terrified and couldn't tell if he was truly crazy or just pretending. I hurriedly left, feeling completely confused. At that moment, the gas worker asked me, "Is he mentally unstable?" I was speechless. Before I could leave the community, I was surrounded by a few people. They said, "If you don't get Steve out of here, we'll call the police. He goes around knocking on other people's doors for food." "I'm hungry, give me something to eat." "Is someone cooking braised meat at your place?" "Just give me a small bowl to taste." Everyone knew he was mentally ill. Who dared to provoke someone with such erratic behavior? Living here felt like having a ticking time bomb. I had a headache and couldn't understand what game Steve was playing. If he was pretending to be crazy, what was his goal? If he was truly insane, then how could he previously think so clearly or ask me to help find Liam a job? Another possibility was that he had been completely insane since he began his cosmetic surgeries. Perhaps only Liam's father, Mr. Hu, could unravel the mystery of the whole situation. Mr. Hu avoided discussing Steve over the phone. And the more he avoided the topic, the more suspicious it seemed. I decided to tell him about Liam returning to the community and working nearby. Mr. Hu repeatedly asked me, "Is that true?" I said, "Why not just ask Liam to find out?" Mr. Hu quickly returned from out of town, intending to take Liam home, but Liam stubbornly refused and ended up arguing with his father. "You don't need to worry about my affairs. That crazy old man treats me way better than you do," Liam retorted at his father. Mr. Hu stared intently at his son and asked, "Do you even know who he is? Do you know his background?" Liam replied, "I tested him last time, he's definitely not what you think." After Mr. Hu returned, he met with me. And Liam began to suspect Steve's true identity. He said, "Steve might be an old friend of mine." When he used the term, "old friend," it was clear he had thought it over carefully, and I decided to dig deeper into Steve's background. Mr. Hu asked me first, "Did Steve say anything to you when he moved in?" I thought for a moment and answered, "No." I decided to meet him, so the three of us arranged to meet at the rundown restaurant in the alley. Mr. Hu scrutinized Steve's strange face. "Have you had plastic surgery?" Steve straightened up and retorted, "I paid for the surgery, did you add any cash?" Mr. Hu's previously tense expression suddenly relaxed. He casually looked at me, seemingly deep in thought. "You weren't called Steve before, right?" Mr. Hu turned to Steve, who looked like some secret had been revealed, and made a vague gesture. "I wasn't called Steve, I was known as Siesun. My dragon-slaying sword was stolen, don't tell others." Mr. Hu shook his head, looking at me with interest, and continued, "Do you know someone named Liang Yong?" Steve thought for a moment and became serious. "He stole the sword," Mr. Hu ignored him. He then asked, "What about Liang Lulu? Do you know her?" "I know her, he has a weapon called the Sun God Staff." Steve lowered his voice, saying, "Whoever possesses the staff can rule the world."
Mr. Who suddenly changed his tone.
Haha, Liang Yong, you're just pretending to be crazy.
Both Mr. Hu and Liam had mentioned Liang Yong, and now Mr. Hu claimed that Steve was Liang Yong,
which left me completely confused. Steve firmly denied it. "I'm not Liang Yong, I'm Xie Sun. I think you look more like Liang Yong." Mr. Hu asked again. "If you were to see Liang Lulu, what would you say to her?" Without hesitation, Steve responded, "Kill her, take the staff, and rule the world."
Mr. Hu sighed with relief. "I think I mistook you for someone else. You're not him, your voice doesn't match either." When he left, he seemed to be much more relaxed. Mr. Hu told me he no longer planned to move Liam away, he couldn't control his son anymore. Although Steve was mentally unstable, he posed no threat to Liam. If he were truly a threat, he might have acted against Liam the moment he moved in. Yet, I remained deeply suspicious. Mr. Hu's arrival did not clear up my doubts, instead, it made me even more uncertain. Why did he suspect that Steve posed a threat to Liam, especially when the pressure from the neighbors was increasing on me? I had no choice but to forcefully say to Steve,
"You should move out, I can refund your rent."
He replied, just like when he caused a scene at the cosmetic surgery clinic.
"The lease isn't up yet, why are you trying to kick me out? Didn't you call me before?"
I sighed in frustration.
"Can you stop causing trouble for the neighbors? Can't you just stay at home quietly?" Steve's face showed anger. "What trouble? My dragon-slaying sword is missing, and you won't help me look for it, yet you're the one causing me problems every day." I felt berated by his relentless accusations.
The neighbors mocked me.
"Mr. Wright, it's easy to invite the god, but difficult to send him away. You can't handle your problems."
I went home to discuss with my wife, thinking that if it came to that, I would refund all of his rent, consider it a contribution. I stuffed the $120,000 into my bag and reluctantly went to find Steve again, but when I knocked, I discovered he wasn't home. Not knowing where he had gone, the neighbor next door said, "I haven't seen him for several days." I felt uneasy. I wondered if he had overdosed on his medication and harmed himself. I hurriedly used my key to open the door, and upon turning on the light, I was met with a mess. The trash bin was still full of psychiatric medications, and empty liquor bottles were strewn across the floor. I tried calling him, and the call connected, but no one answered. Then I received a multimedia message from him. In it, Steve was holding a knife in one hand and a bloody human head in the other. Although I couldn't see the front of the head, just a shadowy back. He laughed maniacally. "I found my dragon-slaying sword, this bastard stole it from me." I was so shocked that I nearly lost my balance and quickly dialed him. He refused to tell me where he was and instead texted me, "Once I find the sun god's staff, alongside the dragon-slaying sword, we can conquer the Central Plains together, killing anyone in our way." I asked the neighbors, "Where do you think he might have gone?" They shook their heads. "No idea, he's been hanging out with Liam, who knows what they're up to." That old man was completely unreliable. Suddenly, it hit me that Steve had recently been climbing mountains with Liam at night. Could they be going hiking? I wondered if he had done something to Liam. Someone from Liam's company had mentioned that Liam was showing off a new pair of shoes and planned to go hiking with friends at night, and the place they frequented was known for night hikes. I dialed Liam's number and was shocked when it actually connected. "Steve, you're really in deep trouble. Ha ha, come and go in a rush, longing for a reunion." Steve had completely lost it. I was certain Liam had been killed by this lunatic. I called the police to report a possible homicide location, saying, "Let's wait until I reach the mountaintop." When I got to the top, however, I couldn't find Steve anywhere. The police asked me, "What is the relationship between Steve and Liam?" I shook my head. "I can't really say." I showed them the multimedia message that Steve had sent, but we still didn't know where he was. The neighbors and Liam's co-workers mentioned that they might have gone hiking. Just when I felt hopeless, I suddenly heard a voice in the distance shouting, "Ha ha, conquering the Central Plains, reviving the call." Looking toward the sound, I spotted a shadow dancing in the night. When we climbed up, the scene before us was horrifying. Liam was agile, while Steve brandished a rusty kitchen knife, shouting at me. "I finally got my revenge, it was him who stole my dragon-slaying sword." A perimeter was quickly established, and a vehicle carrying forensic experts rushed to the scene. The situation was not complicated, the perpetrator was clear. The erratic Steve was taken away in a police car, while Liam's head was unrecognizable, clearly severed after dozens of strikes with a dull knife. This hill was overgrown with weeds, and few people came here, so the case was straightforward. I couldn't understand why Steve had suddenly gone into a rage and killed Liam. I truthfully told the police everything I knew. And based on the testimonies from the neighbors, the consensus was that Steve was clearly mentally ill. The police said determining whether Steve was insane would require a forensic evaluation. An officer asked me, "Didn't you notice that he was using a fake ID?" I couldn't tell the ID's authenticity at all, especially since he had handed me so much rent money. I didn't think about those details. Did he ever act unusually?
Oh, plenty. He completely transformed my house.
I took the police back to the place where Steve had rented, and when they turned on the lights, their experienced eyes were shocked by the scene inside. All the windows in the room were sealed shut, and even the air conditioning vent had been blocked with cement. The police asked,
"As the landlord, how could you let him do this?"
I replied,
"I initially disagreed, but he offered too much. He paid me a total of $120,000. For him, money was nothing, as if it had just fallen from the sky."
The police also investigated the cosmetic surgery clinic, where the doctors stated that a normal person wouldn't want to alter their appearance so drastically.
The interrogation about this case wasn't smooth.
Although Steve readily admitted to killing Liam, his motive remained unclear. He continually said, "He stole my dragon-slaying sword, he deserved to die." When Mr. Hu learned of all this, he was in a coma in the hospital for 3 days. Upon waking, he provided the police with a clue: Steve was likely the Liang Yong he knew from the past. He believed Liang Yong's intention in getting close to Liam was to kill him. However, based on Mr. Hu's lead, police discovered that Liang Yong had divorced 5 years ago and had been living in a mental hospital ever since, giving him no opportunity to commit the crime. Mr. Hu insisted, "That's impossible," but then contradicted himself, adding, "No, he can't be Liang Yong." Although they were similar in height, their voices didn't match. The police continued to press Steve about his identity. Their investigation uncovered another detail. 5 years ago, Liam had been in a juvenile detention center. After he got out, Mr. Hu pulled some strings to send him away from his hometown to study here. However, Liam remained unruly, and Mr. Hu had to withdraw him from school. The reason Liam went to the juvenile detention center wasn't hard to uncover. And it was infuriating. He had pushed a girl named Liang Lulu over the railing from the 5th floor corridor. Liang Lulu's head struck the ground, resulting in immediate death. At the time, Liam was only 14 years old, and according to classmates, he didn't do it intentionally. I found information about this case online, which revealed some unclear aspects. When the school was first built, there were no surveillance cameras installed, making it difficult to determine whether Liam acted intentionally. I didn't fully trust the students' accounts, as in order to throw someone over the railing of a corridor, a series of deliberate actions would need to be executed. He would need to first lift the girl, then position her at the railing, and finally push her over. It simply couldn't have been unintentional. It was clearly a premeditated act disguised as a joke. At the time, Mr. Hu compensated Liang Lulu's family with over 300,000, and Liam was sent to a juvenile detention center. For Mr. Hu, settling with money was a perfect resolution. But for the Liang family, it was a pain that could never be erased. Such suffering is hard for those who haven't experienced it to empathize with. As a father, Liang Yong insisted on appealing the case, but the legal system, in effect, protected Liam, shielding him from any criminal responsibility. After Liam was released from the detention center, he continued living as before, enjoying a lavish life. After Liang Yong divorced his wife, he suffered immense emotional distress and was committed to a mental hospital. The police were still investigating Steve's role in all of this. Only Liang Lulu had a daughter. Through interviews, the police discovered that Steve was Liang Yong's adopted son. After Liang Lulu's death, Steve immediately vanished. The police also learned that Steve's real name was Liang Cheng, and he had met Liang Yong while in charge of projects at a construction team. Indeed, aside from his photo being genuine, every other piece of information on Steve's ID was false. Although Liang Lulu and Liang Cheng were not biological siblings, their relationship was closer than that of real siblings. This explains why Liang Cheng, also known as Steve, was the one who murdered his sister. The puzzling part is why he waited. He could have killed Liam from the beginning.
Yet he only acted when the lease was about to expire. The police summoned me again to take a statement.
When I saw Steve, he appeared calm, his demeanor serene.
The police asked me about the relationship between Liam and Steve. And I honestly informed them.
They got along well. Steve cooked for Liam and bought him shoes.
The police continued. Did they have any conflicts? No conflicts at all.
I replied, noting that Steve had even been extorted by some thugs for Liam.
He was unemployed. Where would he get all that money?
I really don't know. He has no savings under his name.
Did he ever display violent tendencies? The police asked me.
Yes, he often had disputes with others, and after paying the bill, he would smear feces and urine on other people's doors.
Okay, you can go back for now. Has Steve's psychiatric assessment report come out yet? Not yet,
the police replied tersely. At this time, I kept contemplating the sequence of events. A man in his 20s underwent plastic surgery, got close to his enemy, and ultimately killed him.
But why was he taking so many medications?
I asked a doctor friend, and he said there's only one possibility: he wanted to completely turn himself into a mental patient, thus escaping the law's punishment. Because once his psychiatric evaluation report was established, he would be untouchable. I suddenly realized that Liam, to some extent, was protected by the law. What Steve did was essentially a manifestation of legal statutes. Article 18 of the criminal law states that a mentally ill person who causes harmful consequences due to the inability to recognize or control their actions, as confirmed by legal procedures, is exempt from criminal responsibility.
Steve's goal was to make the Liang family suffer, while the murderer could evade criminal accountability,
allowing him to continue living a life of indulgence.
If Steve was deemed mentally ill, the pain endured by the Liang family would be even more severe than what the Hu family faced.
Steve had no guardians, so even if the Liang family sought compensation, they wouldn't know whom to hold accountable. It was truly unjust.
He was desperately taking medications.
But these drugs were not to treat his illness, they were meant to damage his brain. Whenever he had conflicts with others, everyone turned into the most powerful witnesses against him. He sealed the windows, living only in darkness to suppress his mental state for an extended period. His drinking was an attempt to further harm his brain while on medication. He altered his appearance to ensure his enemies wouldn't recognize him. From the moment he stepped into the cosmetic surgery clinic 5 years ago, Steve had begun plotting murder. He was a normal person, and while his actions appeared abnormal, they were extremely rational.
He was crazy, and although his actions seemed insane, they were anything but. Why should the law protect the perpetrator? In broad daylight, a minor commits murder. Does that mean the victim, also a minor, deserves to die?
How was Steve able to maintain a meticulous thought process while simultaneously damaging his own brain, and still ask me to help Liam find a job? I recalled that after Mr. Hu began questioning Steve's identity,
he had Liam withdraw from school and move away from the community. But Liam came back later.
At that time, Mr. Hu had already informed his son that Steve was intentionally getting close to him. I returned to Steve's residence and found a plastic dragon-slaying sword in his nightstand, with the words,
"To my dear brother, hope you're happy every day, and don't forget to smile."
Inside the handle, there was a layer filled with sticky notes. They had started to suspect me, to keep Liam close, spending lavishly. Was he realizing he was about to leave? As the landlord, I could control both wealth and my life through him to stabilize Liam. Today, I planned to call Liam and ask him to help me find a job. After all the effort it took to find my enemy, I couldn't let him slip away so easily. It turned out that he used sticky notes to keep his brain aware of these matters. He also mentioned that Liam had once talked about Liang Yong and Liang Lulu. He obviously felt the probing from his enemies, but fortunately, he managed to hold back from revealing the secrets of those sticky notes. I can't let the police see what I bring back. If they burn it, I won't be afraid of any trouble coming from them.
Some things are better left unknown.
Steve wagered his life, and I would help him fulfill that wish. I received another notification from the police, asking me to describe Steve's behaviors since he had moved in.
I took 10 minutes to detail Steve's actions to the police, but I didn't mention his active medication use.
The neighbors who usually clashed with Steve became his advocates, claiming that if Steve wasn't mentally ill, then no one could be. They clearly saw that he was extremely unstable, exhibiting typical symptoms of mental illness oscillating between good and bad states.
To be honest, I didn't believe Steve would kill anyone. How could he do that to Liam, a person he had such a good relationship with? Which person would spend money on their enemy?
I told the police that I hoped Steve lived in constant fear, worrying that I would ask him about braised meat.
Just thinking about the last time he came with a bowl asking for meat was laughable.
Steve's eyes were telling, they were dull, with yellowed scara, indicating he might really have liver disease. The owner of the rundown restaurant confirmed that Steve had indeed swung a knife at some thugs, and he had turned red-eyed, facing 7 or 8 people alone.
What normal person would dare do that?
3 days later, Steve's psychiatric evaluation report was released, diagnosing him with severe schizophrenia. The police were unable to prosecute Steve, he couldn't even remember killing anyone. Mr. Who began preparing materials and hired a lawyer to seek justice for Liam.
I finally understood why Steve hadn't killed Liam from the beginning. Steve was waiting and gambling.
He was gambling on how his long-term drug abuse and alcoholism had messed up his brain. The final judicial evaluation was critical for him. Only through long-term, heavy medication, combined with having no guardians, could he apply for temporary involuntary treatment.
Despite the evaluation report, I still couldn't accurately determine whether he was truly insane or just pretending. Standing by his hospital bed, the police asked me, "What do you think?" Steve looked at me with innocent eyes, mumbling, "Have you found the dragon-slaying sword?"
I patted his hand, and he replied,
"I found it!" "Then what are we waiting for? Let's conquer the Central Plains and punish the wicked."
The police shook their heads and told me,
"You're the only one who knows him. Since this case is still unresolved, if you have any difficulties in taking care of him, let us know immediately."
I nodded and watched them leave. After standing at the door for a while, I returned to the ward once I saw their car drive away. I quietly sat in front of the bed and peeled an apple for him.
"I don't know what to call you. Steve or Liang Chang?
You keep insisting I collect money and not worry about anything else.
Is it that you don't want me to know what's really happening with you?"
You often hike with Liam, that rusty blade you used to sever his head must have been placed there in advance.
Because if you had a knife on you that day, it would imply you had the intent to kill. Regardless of whether you're Steve or Liang Qing, at least you did what you wanted to do. He continued to gaze at me with innocent eyes. "Liang Qing, are you really Steve? Steve, are you really Liang Qing?" Another question, with Liam being so strong, how could you ensure you could kill him?
I murmured to myself, and his muddled eyes gradually brightened. From his lips, I heard a familiar tone.
"Mr. Wright, darkness makes a person stronger. If you really want to know, why don't you ask Liam?"
I smiled slightly, thinking to myself,
"You're truly insane, a complete lost cause."
I leaned down closer to his ear and whispered, "Liang Qing, you should never wake up. Wait for me, I'll find the best lawyer, using the 120,000 you gave me." He grasped my hand, tears welling in his eyes, but I quickly pulled my hand away. I don't shake hands with lunatics. I took out the plastic dragon-slaying sword from my bag and handed it to him.
"See? I wasn't lying, was I? When I said I found it, I really did."
After that, I quietly closed the door and dialed the number for the most reputable law firm in the city.
"Hello, what are the fees for your most professional criminal lawyer?" "I want the best, money isn't an issue."